This is the title of our panel. Today's Ethical Self, Negotiating Ethics in the Digital Sphere. I'm Sam J. from Metro State University of Denver. We'll just go in order of the program here. I'll introduce everybody and then we can just kind of present. If you want to stand up here and talk or you want to sit down and talk, it's up to you guys, whatever you want to do. So, the first one will be Jen Supple-Bartles from the University of Dubuque, Parents, Growing Pains on Social Media. And then we'll go to Zach Gershberg from Idaho State University, Vigilant Watchdogs, Policing Journalism Ethics in the Digital Media Age. And then we'll go to Matt Bellinger from the University of Washington, Technologies of Disavowal, Agency and Responsibility in Digital Communication. And then Kate Hoyt from the University of Denver, Network as the Third Person. And then myself, A Collapse of Spheres, Politics, Digital Communication, and the Rise of Personal Ethics. So we'll start with Jen. Go ahead.
All right, and I will stand simply out of nervous habit.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to start with the assumption that we are all aware that parents post about their children online in the digital sphere. What you may not be aware of is what a worthy endeavor that is in terms of feedback. So on Facebook, posts about your children get nearly double the positive response that non-child posts get you. So it's a drug and it's a good one, and of course people want it. Now, there has been some backlash, of course, to this oversharing, which you are most likely aware of. Listicles like top 10 things I hate about mommy blogs, the app Unbaby Me, which will remove all traces of other people's children from your social media. I call it Baby Be Gone. And kind of the flagship site, which is STFU Parents. And just please don't ask me to spell that out. So, if you were kind of paying attention to this evolution and this conversation about this, the kind of the pinnacle, the moment when, if you'll forgive the vernacular, shit got real, was when Amy Webb posted an article entitled, "We post nothing about our daughter online. Nothing. To do anything more would be to rob her of a digital adulthood free from bias and presupposition." And I mean, that is a stance, and it's kind of known as the tabula rasa of digital parenting. So Amy's pretty well in the minority on this, because according to a 2012 study, 92% of US children have a digital footprint, an online presence, prior to their second birthday, and that is because of their parents disclosing about them online. 33% of those children have a digital footprint prior to their birth, thanks to prenatal sonograms. So, with all of this running around, oversharing, tabula rasa, some questions started to emerge for me. What does it mean to parent with integrity in the digital sphere? How do we balance, or how do parents balance using social media to update family and friends about their life, including their children, with respecting the boundaries of those potentially not old enough to understand what is being disclosed about them, much less give consent? In other words, where is the ethical line in leaving a digital footprint for others, specifically when those others are children? And as soon as I started to ask those questions, I started to get questions back. Like, really? Why is this a thing? It's social media. That's what it's for. And besides, how is posting online really all that different from posting, or rather parents sharing about their children, stories, photos, videos, like they've always done since, people have been having kids? Well, the difference lies in two key aspects of the digital sphere, and those are scope and permanence. So what is amusing and momentary in face-to-face interaction takes on an entirely different tone when the potential audience moves to approximately 2 billion users worldwide and is, in effect, unerasable. So, given the ever-evolving technological landscape, parenting with integrity online is a moving target, I think always will be, but Kumar and Schoenbeck have come up with the most beautiful, concise, unlike this presentation, term to encapsulate how parents might navigate this, and that is privacy stewardship. So taking care of that, which is not your own, until those whose it is are able to care for it. Simple. Until you try to do it. And I state that as a recovering oversharenter. And what I've come to realize is that it's not just a concept or a term, but rather a reflective practice involving both awareness and authenticity. All right, so the awareness, briefly. Awareness having to do with the identity work that parents are doing when they're disclosing about their children online. So identity work, face work, self-presentation, impression management, we all know the terms. When parents are disclosing about their children, when is it about their children? And when parents are disclosing about their children, when is it really about the parents through said disclosure? As an example, little baby, and this is where tech would be awesome because I've got the picture, but little baby so-and-so was born this morning. Awesome. Congratulations. Little baby so-and-so was born this morning and came into the world through 100% natural, unmedicated warrior mama childbirth. Indirect self-presentation, obviously. All right. So little baby so-and-so's parent, in this case their mother, was using little baby so-and-so as a prop in their self-presentation. Like, okay, well that's harsh. You're telling me I'm using my child as an object and a prop to make myself look better. Yes. And of course, if I can just, as an aside, humble bragging is the art of indirect self-presentation when done with your children. It is truly the highest art form of that action, and frankly, probably my favorite to collect samples of. But, so what? Parents can never post. How do you figure out, great, I'm not going to do that anymore. How do I figure out what I'm going to share about my children online? And that's where authenticity comes into play. Authenticity, very complex, ambiguous term. Let's try to, for the sake of time, distill it into 3 words, and that is a sense of truth. You could say, hey, I can share whatever I want about my kids because it's true, but let's consider respect for the other. And children as a distinct, concrete, and carrying moral weight. And that's, okay, fine, but I like to stick in, the word is escaping me right now, which is glorious, but it's that collection of things you distill down to letters. Damn it. WYPTAAA. Would you post that about an adult? So, I don't know if I'm in the wrong circles, but I don't see a lot of content online that has to do with adults talking about the pooping behavior of other adults. Maybe I'm in the wrong circles, but you can't throw a stick at parents posting about their children without seeing something about them talking about their kids' bathroom behavior. In fact, that STFU site that I mentioned earlier, their most popular section is on the excrement misbehavior of children and parents talking about it. If children, according to Edith Weisbrod, hold an equal moral weight as adults, then how can there be separate ethical lines for disclosing about them in the digital sphere? So, finally, that takes us to whose truth is it, and whose truth is it to tell, and Dee Marmite's consideration of space and time, because why wouldn't that have to do with authenticity? Space as it relates to spheres, so private, spheres and disclosure. So the private and discrete, the social and the group, and of course the public, which is what we're used to talking about in the digital sphere. A friend of mine once put it that we are now having conversations with megaphones online. So what would be considered private or discrete disclosure is taking place in the public sphere. So space, and then also time. So what is true in a moment, in a given context, is not necessarily true for the entirety of your life. And I think anyone who survived the 80s can attest to not wanting to be known for our past misadventures. So again, space, scope, and time permanency. Those things we talked about earlier. Okay, so wrapping up, getting back to that question of how to navigate the ethical line in creating and leaving digital footprints for others, especially when those others are children. I propose that we move from a presumptive technical determinism, where the medium is the moral code, to the reflective practice of privacy stewardship through the application of identity work awareness and respectful time, space, sensitive authenticity. And in doing so, we are hopefully going to be modeling for those children the ethical treatment of others in the digital sphere. Thank you.
All right, next up will be Zach Gershberg, Vigilant Watchdogs, Policing Journalism Ethics in the Digital Media Age.
It's going to be hard to focus after that last presentation. I have an 8-month-old.
Sorry, I'm not judging
self-conscious
anyone.
meter is running through the room. Good. Okay, so public trust in journalism has never been lower. I mean, I don't think that's too controversial a term, but evidence bears this out. 2014 nationwide poll conducted by Gallup, only 40% of Americans expressed confidence in the ability of the mass media, newspapers, television, radio, internet, to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. Another 2014 Gallup poll asking Americans whether they had a great deal or avoided a lot of confidence in the news media reported that only 22% held such views for newspapers, 19% for online news, and 18% for television news. Aside from trust, the majority of Americans, 63%, find the news media to be biased in their reporting. Complicating matters even more, a host of economic forces beset contemporary journalism, ranging from ownership issues such as media consolidation to an overall loss of advertising revenue. From the vantage point of the public and journalists themselves, the outlook then really does appear grim. Yet journalism, both as a practice as well as a topic of public concern, is a highly visible issue, and I would argue more than ever before in American history at least. The current digital media landscape, filled as it is with bloggers, citizen groups, professional media watchdogs, such as Media Research Center on the political right, Media Matters on the political left, serve a twofold function: to identify bias, fabrications, and inaccuracies, and to provoke a sustained public discussion of the proper role of journalism and journalistic practices. So there's no mistake in the structural problems facing the business and practices of journalism, but it's worth acknowledging that digital media has also ushered in an age of unprecedented journalism accountability that leads to greater participation in journalism from the public, both as a form of democratic discourse and as an independent monitor of those who supply society with information. Two key elements drive this change. First, the news media no longer possess its long-standing gatekeeping function as an elite site of power that assesses what information and issues are worthy of public dissemination. Social media networks and online news sites can simultaneously cover a multiplicity of subjects unencumbered by the daily confines of a newspaper space or a 30-minute television broadcast, 22 minutes without commercials. As a result, the information available to the public is more fluid and open because of digital media, even if many consumers are self-selecting and choosing where they obtain news. Second, digital media has demonstrated a more immediate ability to assess and discuss the practices of journalism. The exposure of numerous ethical lapses, fabrications, and plagiarism in the news media over the past 2 decades has certainly fed into the severe public mistrust of journalists and mass media. But the propensity to hold journalists to public account and hold the media outlets responsible for such transgressions it ultimately serves and reflects, I think, a healthy democratic society. That which constitutes effective and ethical journalism is now regularly a part of our public discourse. This self-reflection function requires media outlets and journalists alike to diligently consider the accuracy of their reporting lest they be cited as biased, unethical, or having fabricated material. Scandals certainly embarrass and devalue the respect the public has for journalists and media outlets that publish and broadcast their work, but the ensuing public discourse generated about the practices of journalism, broadly construed, is a relatively new and worthy phenomenon. The tension between the public's perception and the media themselves mark an index of democratic alertness in American society. Digital media have engendered a highly discursive form whereby journalism is truly valued now as the fourth estate or branch of government. All those Gallup polls, by the way, it's bad that journalists rank about 20% approval. Well, Congress is at like 7%. So at least they got that going. So, you know, Americans can now more adequately check the news media and exercise their democratic right to voice dissatisfaction with it. While media critiques may be at times motivated by cynical political gain, journalists are on the whole now held more accountable for their work, which I think is a positive development. Besides, I really do think a perfect press is an illusory goal for a democracy. While journalists can and should seek an ideal of excellence in their reporting, the methods of news gathering and the dissemination of information can never achieve unqualified neutrality, objectivity, or transparency. A democratic public, moreover, would be wise to distrust a national media infrastructure working in such a monolithic lockstep. So while, you know, these problems facing the practices of journalism certainly are very real and merit appropriate concern, the current state of affairs does deserve some degree of appreciation. Journalism is no longer merely a repository of information shoveled to a passive public by elite gatekeeping forces. It now represents both diffuse forms of public information and a dialogic clearing space within which citizens, institutions, organizations, and politicians, in addition to media professionals, openly assess how information is procured, published, and broadcast. Both the fierce contemporary debates about journalism and the recent spike in exposing journalistic malpractice help solidify the separation of powers between the government, the press, and the public. This newfound ability to immediately identify journalistic scandal and then engage in public discourse about it ultimately reflects a more vigorous and democratic public sphere. The public, it's true, exhibits more feelings of distrust in news media than ever before, but American journalism, owing to the profusion of digital media, has really never been held more accountable. And so, to establish this, you know, I wanted to kind of give you where I'm going with it, and I'm going to follow up, but I go through kind of really quickly through American history. The two things that drive, right, distrust in media is bias and fabrications. Well, in some ways, you know, through the long lens, going back to even before the American Revolution, you know, Samuel Adams is admired as a patriot, right? And his Journal of Public Occurrences, well, he fabricated a lot of that stuff about the behavior of British soldiers and things like that. To, oh my God, Hearst Pulitzer during like the USS Maine and things like that. And so I kind of go through history, and what I'm really interested in is this sort of time lapse. You know, because I'm talking about accountability, but like how do I show that? So basically, it was up to basically historians to call out journalism. You know, years later we found out, you know, and things like that. And it's interesting that even if, and I look at a series of case examples starting in the early 80s with Janet Cook at the Washington Post, who won a Pulitzer. I mean, Bob Woodward was her editor at the Post, and she fabricated the story of like a 5-year-old drug dealer and then had to hand her thing back. And they only found out that she fabricated because really her Pulitzer biographical data, she falsified that. And then they started asking questions into that and found all this stuff. And what's interesting to me is the condensed time lapse. So the scandals of the 90s with Stephen Glass and some of these other people, you know, magazine writers, and Jack Kelly at USA Today. And so for me, what I find is 2004 is this point of departure. All right, you know, I really think something happened in 2004. It featured a series of events that make it stand out as a shift in the abilities and practices of digital media. Google had their initial IPO, Facebook was created, and according to the Pew Research Center, for the first time more Americans began accessing the web via broadband rather than dial-up. So to me, it creates this Google game. Also in 2004, that was when we saw the Republican convention And basically that whole campaign was basically an anti-media campaign. If you go back and look at those speeches, I mean, it was, pillaring the mainstream media. And then, maybe for good reason, this was also right around the time of the Dan Rather 60 Minutes report. And what's amazing to me is most mainstream outlets the next day never really looked into those documents. It was 3 conservative blogs that night on all the message boards where they were like analyzing and discussing these things. And so I think this kind of, this immediate Googleification, you could call it, but I think having this alertness, I mean, there's so many problems with journalism, and obviously, you probably can tell, I wrote this paper before the Brian Williams stuff, so that may totally screw up. But I mean, it's interesting that it wasn't his reporting, right? It was his tall tales told in these interviews and things like that. And to be fair, I've never known a journalist who hasn't exaggerated the story to myself. But I mean, but at the same time, I don't have a lot of sympathy for a journalist making $10 million because a year, so that's different. Ethically, I'm really interested in a couple of cases. Grantland.com, which is owned by ESPN, had a really interesting case last year with Caleb Hannon, who wrote an article on this Dr. V person who invented this new putter in golf. Well, she passed herself off as an MIT-trained scientist who worked on a stealth bomber. Well, come to find out, she was actually a transgendered person who was a former car mechanic. And so the journalist actually outed her in such a way, and she ended up committing suicide before the thing went to press. And the reaction was super, super swift, and it created this really rich dialogue about transgendered issues and how the media should cover it. And so I think that's really just effective. That we can provoke these things, or even the Brian Williams issue, provoked a discussion of what is journalism ethics. And given the long kind of tale of American journalism, I think that is ultimately healthy. I mean, and so it's really difficult as a professor of journalism dealing with my students knowing the market out there. But I think that's something that I think is ultimately a healthy indicator for our society and relatively good. All right, thank you.
All right, next up, Matt. Technology to disavowal, agency, and responsibility in digital communication.
All right, let me begin with a simple observation. People quite often regret what they say. And this in turn gives rise to a whole category of communication aimed at excusing, contextualizing, and defending past statements. Disavowal, what we previously said, is part and parcel of the communicative process. But the opportunities and incentives for this disavowal may vary between different media. In face-to-face communication, for instance, one of the more common places this pops up is excuse something as a slip of the tongue, right? We've all said or heard the equivalent of "that's not what I meant to say." And despite the protestations of Freud, in our everyday lives, this generally works, right? This happens all the time, and we don't really think too much about it. And although this kind of appeal to unconscious disruption still works in digital media, digital platforms have also given us new tropes of disavowal, new patterns, norms, and habits of excusing or explaining away that untimely utterance that we really didn't mean like that. Now, it's worth noting that every disavowal communication invokes, to some degree, a particular ethical framework. This goes for both the sender and the receiver of a disavowed message. If I'm trying to convince you not to interpret what I said in a particular way or to just ignore it, right, I've necessarily made a judgment about the appropriateness of my avoidance of responsibility for what I previously said. Similarly, if you are on the receiving end of that, you have to decide whether it's appropriate to kind of let it slide or not. So by looking at particular patterns of disavowal, particular ways of avoiding responsibility for one's communication, it's possible to discern an implicit ethics. And since patterns and tropes of disavowal may vary between media, these implicit ethical frameworks can shed light not only on the ways in which we try to avoid responsibility for our own speech, but also on the ethics embedded in particular ways of relating to communication technologies. So with this in mind, I'd like to spend the rest of my time here looking at two forms of communicative disavowal, which I think at this point are somewhat firmly enshrined in contemporary digital culture. The first is the excuse that I was hacked, and the second is, oh, that was autocorrect. Both things we see all the time in the news or in our daily lives. So in what follows, I'll try to tease out the understandings of responsibility and ethics embedded in each of those. And ultimately, I'm going to argue that the I was hacked disavow figures ethical problems as essentially technical, pragmatic concerns, whereas the autocorrect disavow complicates this approach. So first, the I was hacked. In this case, an individual disavows what they previously communicated by claiming that some third party has gained access to their device or account and then impersonated that individual. So, for example, there's a case I like to use a lot in my teaching. There's a lot to tease out of it, but in the wake of the 2012 presidential election, there were, of course, all these responses to the election flying around on Twitter, some of which were quite racist in their content. The online news outlet Jezebel got wind of these racist tweets and picked up that some of these were coming from high schoolers, and they ran a series of posts highlighting this. Look at these high school students tweeting these racist tweets. They called school administrators, asked about how this related to codes of conduct, all this sort of thing. In response to being called out on this, some of the students claimed that, oh, my tweet was a joke, it was taken out of context, like that was meant for a specific audience, right? Other students just deleted their accounts, didn't engage at all. But some students claimed that they weren't actually behind it, that they were hacked, right? So the defense here is basically that, sure, there's this hate speech, but I didn't say it, I'm not responsible for it. Now, this is a kind of well-worn trope. I mean, this happens all the time for people kind of trying to excuse speech online, and I suspect that most of us have grown wary of accepting this as face value. But it's also worth noting that this disavowal can be, at least in some instances, a completely legitimate excuse. It takes no special skill to access someone else's social media account, especially if they've left themselves logged in. And then, as that famous New Yorker cartoon of the web-surfing canine reminds us, it's difficult to tell the identity of someone on the other end of the online communication. The technological affordance of this pseudo-anonymity is built into the platform of Twitter, and for all we know, the individual who posted the hate speech to a student's Twitter account might not actually be the student who claims the account. So what I find interesting here in the I was hacked disavowal is that regardless of whether or not we take it to be legitimate, there's an implicit communicative ethic that specifies the grounds by which that defense may be judged as legitimate or illegitimate. First of all, this disavowal assumes that communicative responsibility is tied to communicative agency. It's the individual who made the choice to communicate in a particular way, send a particular message that should bear the weight of that communication. And in this ethical framework, it makes no sense to hold an individual responsible for the speech of another. Now, if the ethic here hinges on responsibility, and this responsibility is tied to agency, this also implicitly suggests a procedure for identifying the responsible party, right? Just trace the chain of causality back, figure out who exactly posted the tweet. And this isn't, of course, feasible on the platform of Twitter for the everyday user at least, but that impossibility is a product of the platform's structure. Right? It's a pragmatic technical limit, not kind of a fundamental ontological one. There's no reason why the medium cannot be designed to more clearly identify who exactly is speaking. So in this way, the I was hacked defense implicitly equates an ethical problem to a technical problem, one that can be solved not through kind of social negotiation of determining who exactly should be responsible for what, but rather by engineering more transparent communication technologies. And this emphasis on transparency as an ethical solution resonates with a whole other area of common discourse in digital culture. Facebook's insistence on connecting your account to your real identity, your real name, problematic in so many ways. But the emphasis on transparency, WikiLeaks, open source software, right? The emphasis on kind of there's a technical solution of transparency to some social, political, ethical problem. And if we accept the fundamental premise of the I was hacked disavowal, that communicative responsibility is inextricably tied to communicative agency, then the technical pursuit of transparency does seem to kind of resolve this problem, at least in theory. But I'd like to problematize that premise a bit by turning to my second example of autocorrect. Imagine for a moment the following scenario. In an attempt to coordinate a lunch meeting, I type out a text message to a friend. I'm very hungry, let's meet at noon. But unfortunately, I'm a bit clumsy, and instead of carefully selecting the keys necessary to spell hungry, my fingers smudge a combination of keys less precise, S-N-G-R-Y. My phone strains its algorithms to make the best of this jumbled input and automatically corrects this to angry, producing, I'm very angry, let's meet at noon. I send the message, my friend receives it and understands it perfectly, all the while missing what I, of course, intended to say. But there's no malicious third party intervening here to put words in my mouth. The keys in the algorithm produce exactly the message that I type, even if it's not what I meant to type. And it doesn't even really make sense to speak of, at least initially, this transmutation of hungry to angry as a mistake or an error, since the very designation of error is a retroactive disavowal, right? That's not what I meant. I have to explain that with some sort of meta-communication saying that was autocorrect. Now, there's certainly formal similarities between I was hacked and it was autocorrect. In both instances, the disavowal works by placing the blame on some intervening agent, some third party, either the hacker or the algorithm. But blaming autocorrect isn't quite the same as blaming another person. With the autocorrect disavowal, technology itself takes the blame. But this very gesture of blaming technology undermines the assumption embedded in the hacker disavowal that communicative responsibility is tied to communicative agency. Again, the algorithms in my phone can't really be said to have made a mistake. They simply process input according to a certain set of instructions informed by my past selections and what I corrected to. And there's no kind of possibility of deviation from that. It just processes the data. There's not interpretation there. So there's no agency with autocorrect. So who are we blaming? What this example points out, I think, is the extent to which responsibility can be a bit more complicated than the more transparency perspective suggests. When I blame autocorrect, what I'm really doing is asking my receiver to ignore my last message. And my receiver's willingness to do that is necessarily something that's socially negotiated, right? It's informed by the history of our relationship, right? The nature of the message, and all these sorts of things. So the push for more transparency is an end unto itself. This technical solution to an ethical problem seems to be fundamentally ill-suited for the sense of responsibility embedded in this autocorrect example. There's no party that is truly self-evidently responsible, precisely because responsibility is something that is negotiated after the fact. That we agree, oh yeah, that was a mistake, or that was an accident, or no, that wasn't autocorrect, you were saying that, you were just being mean. Right? Just as with the slip of the tongue, where my receiver's willingness to overlook my communication depends on their social relationship to me, the autocorrect disavowal focuses on responsibility as a social construct, not as a technical problem. So I think there's at least two takeaways from this. First, that while ethical problems may seem in certain instances to have technical solutions, this view requires a substantial limiting of what we consider ethics to be. Second, the more our communication technologies rely on algorithmic intervention, the more this intervention becomes ubiquitous, the more we need to intentionally develop norms and expectations about who should be held responsible for what communication and under what circumstances. To return to the example of the racist tweets that I mentioned earlier, the clarity offered by limiting ethics to the question of whether or not a student's Twitter account was actually hacked, or whether they're just making up that excuse, completely sidesteps a whole bundle of complicated ethical questions. For instance, whether or not we want to hold teenagers accountable for what they've said as a teenager for the rest of their lives. Seeing some resonance in our presentations. And so I won't try to tackle that particular question here. We can talk about it more in the Q&A if we want. But, I do think that these are important questions to ask, and we can really only ask them if we accept communicative responsibility and practices of communicative disavowal in all the nuances that they require, of all that messiness.
Okay, next up will be Kate Hoyt, network as the third person.
Okay, so I was expecting some text, so I'm just going to turn my computer around and show you this picture. I should also point out that this essay has undergone some huge transformation, so that's actually not the title anymore. So I am now calling this essay the ethics of network subjectivity. So, in April 2014, aerial surveillance drones discovered this large-scale portrait. I don't know if you guys can see it. Discovered this large-scale portrait of a young girl in a field in northwest Pakistan.
I can see it, right? I feel terrible if you don't have a screen.
All right, so this is actually a 100-foot by 70-foot large-scale print that's only viewable by aerial surveillance. So on the ground, you cannot actually see what the content of the portrait is. You can only see sort of this swath of pixels, right? But from the air, you can see this child's face holding this piece of unrecognizable rope in her hand, staring directly into the camera. She's got this sort of piercing gaze that the affect is very intense. It's sort of ineffable. It's unnameable. We don't know exactly what she's feeling. And so all we know of her is the gaze. So this child was reportedly orphaned in a U.S.-sponsored drone attack in Pakistan. So she lost both her parents and a sibling. We don't know her name. We don't know her whereabouts right now. And the title of this piece is #NotABugSplat. So one thing about that title is bug splat is military slang for the visual phenomena of seeing dead bodies in scorched terrain through the pixelated aerial view of the drone camera in the aftermath of an attack. So the title was directly related to this dehumanized gaze that we see from the words bug splat as used within the U.S. military. So after this piece made a splash in the digital world, Science Magazine published an article titled, "This Giant Art Piece Won't Be Making Drone Pilots Feel Empathy." So the author Mike Pearl argues against the effectiveness of the art piece as protest. His argument is, one would be hard-pressed to believe that not a bug splat would directly cause a drone operator to abandon her mission. So the artist claim, and there is an artist statement that claims that this piece is speaking back to the drone operator. So that artist claim is false, because the drone operator will not abandon the act of drone warfare. So also in the article, Mike Pearl calls this piece Banksy meets Coney 2012, straight up uncut internet heroin. So back to like the idea of the drug. So the argument is, not a bug splat offers well-meaning but misinformed internet citizens a way to experience the satisfaction and complacency of having fought oppression without engaging in any of the structural changes that would remediate the problem or change the behavior of the drone operator. This is a quote from that article. The reality is that this isn't meant for drone pilots at all. It's meant for us, the internet. So one of the first things that I set out to answer in this piece is, who is us, the internet, that Pearl is talking to? And so in order to answer that question, I think one must look past the internet as a piece of technological infrastructure and conceive of it more as a subject. Does the internet have a subjectivity? And I'm arguing, yes, it does. If we look past subjectivity as being contained by the individual, if we get rid of the individuated fallacy, we can sort of conceive of this subjectivity that is both constituted by and summoned through the network. So Pearl's us, the internet, is this subjectivity that is conceived of more than the addition of 1 plus 1. It's greater than the sum of its parts. It's greater than a collection of individuals. And it's an expanding and fluid subjectivity. And that's what I call the network subject. So it's this presence beyond individual human agency, this binding force that expands subjectivity past the barriers of the skin. So this is not a new idea, this idea that our individuated selves are really just constructions, right? So Deleuze and Guattari, their idea of assemblage as these subjectivities arising out of relations between mechanical processes, leading the movement of the discipline beyond the acceptance of the predetermined structures of self, or the ethical self, and also the body. Also, Gilbert Simondon, probably not pronouncing it right, but idea of the pre-individual, that we have movements of affects and flows of information across structures, across bodies, across forms, a process that creates the effect of a perceived individualized experience, but is not necessarily ontologically the origin of subjectivity. And then finally, Mark Hansen applies all of this to our use of technology and his idea of the embodied prosthesis, that when we use technology, it actually expands our agency, our subjectivity past the skin and into the network itself, so that when I we can even see in our use of like cell phones, like we see it as like an appendage, right? We can't help but think of the attachment we have to this silly piece of technology, and yet it expands my individuated agency beyond my body. So my main argument is Not a Bug Flight can be seen as a successful work of protest art in the ways it constitutes, interpolates, and speaks to an emerging subject through the network. This network creates a presence of a material collective witness, which interrupts the secrecy of the act of drone warfare. So, first question is, how does Not a Bug Flight constitute and interpolate its audience? So, traditionally, rhetorical acts are sort of constructed as this direct relationship between, the speaker and the audience, and these roles are predetermined. And this is what Wiesecker criticizes as the logic of influence. It sort of ignores the constitutive capacities of rhetoric, right? So what we see is that the true audience of Not a Bug Flight is not the drone operator, not the intended audience for the preconceived idea of this art piece, but rather the network public. And this is clear from the massive response that the piece had within the digital public arena. So there were 115 million impressions in less than 2 months. This piece won a Cannes Lions Award. And additionally, museums and cultural institutions began to contact the agency that printed the portrait, wanting copies as ways of sort of showing their affiliation with the anti-drone movement. So what I'm seeing is that the little girl becomes an image event that stands for this larger movement of anti-drone sentiment. So what we find is that the picture itself is a site of subjectivity, a gateway constituted by the portrait's being in the world. So again, this image event, DeLuca and Delica describe that image events as mind bombs that explode in the public's consciousness to transform the way people view their world. So image events act on both the subconscious and sort of the affect of the general digital public, inexorably linking picture with movement. What Not a Bug Flight also contributes is a means through which an assemblage of abstract events, affects, and narratives surrounding the ethical unease of the United States drone war is made visible and tangible, right? So our drone war is something that's very secret, it's something that's highly nuanced, we don't quite understand what the process is, we don't quite understand, we don't even know who the victims are because it's been so much shrouded in secrecy. So this condensation symbol of the little girl's face is a point at which we can direct our ethical unease. All of these aspects come together. So Harriman and Lucchese argue that images can be condensation symbols. They can focus dispersed fields of intensities that provide the public audience with sufficient means for comprehending potentially unmanageable events. So furthermore, the portrait of Not a Bug Flight opens up this field of convergence between individuated bodies, subjectivities, in its interpolation or hailing of the network public ethical response. So for a second, let's look at the actual content of Not a Bug Flight. So again, we don't know the orphan. We don't know her situation. We don't know the details of the situation. We don't even know her name. We don't know where she is right now. There's something about her that's both universal, right, and anonymous. So she could be standing in for all victims of drone warfare. She could be standing in for the gaze of the network public. But there's this message that someone is watching. This message, someone is watching, dismantles the secrecy upon which the United States depends to enact its drone war, right? The presence of the network subject, once apprehended, cannot be shaken, permanently altering the public screen's relationship to the act of drone warfare. So what I argue is that the true rhetorical power of Not a Bug Flight comes from the image of the orphan child as a symbol that constitutes its own audience and calls it into being through the in-between of the network. This audience, marked by both its heterogeneity and its commonality, becomes a subject compelled to respond to the specific face of the little girl and the universal face of a humanity that allows and therefore perpetuates the remote killings. So in this process of fluid convergence of subjectivity, where the individual allows herself to flow beyond individually marked her individually marked body and into sort of the network of humanity, the network subject realizes its own complicity in the drone war, in the drone attacks. So in the infinite regress of the orphan child's eyes, I am the drone operator. The drone operator is me. We are the self-same. So just in terms of defining subject and subjectivity, it's obviously been defined in many ways. I turn to more of a post-structural definition of it. I look at Lev Manovich and Mark Hansen. They both sort of describe the subject as the state of in-between. So Mark Hansen derives his definition from Henri Bergson, who uses the phrase center of indetermination to describe subjectivity as what comes between an internally felt intensity and an external milieu. Not necessarily contained by the body, but it's that in-between of the internal and the external. At the same time, Manovich describes how entanglement between the body and the mediated environment interpolates, not in the all too there kind of interpolates with an O and only one L. The subject between perceiving and acting. So the concept of the subject as the in-between explains the network subject's significance existing with the in-between of these individual bodies within the flow of the network itself. So we can take the theoretical basis for subjectivity the same way we understand the virtual, this in-between liminal space of entanglement, where the flow of the surrounding milieu collides with internally felt intensities and affects, a collision which compels an automatic response. So again, it's not to the drone operators that Out-of-Box Flat speaks, but to this collective witness. So I just want to be clear that the network through which operators control the drones remotely from the U.S. Air Force Base in Nevada is not the same as the World Wide Web. But what happens is through kind of hacking the network, not through any technological prowess, but through basically hacking the very terrain that the drones use to target their surveillance, we sow doubt in the closeness of the network, of the military network. We can say, once you've been hacked, your network is no longer closed. Someone is watching. This dismantles the secrecy upon which this dismantles the secrecy upon which the U.S. relies to enact its drone warfare, right? So what the question here, return to Mike Pearl's argument and my criticism thereof, he describes it as internet heroin. The reason why he describes it as internet heroin is because it makes us feel something. It makes us feel complacent and like we are engaging in this ethical act without actually doing an act. My argument is that there is an act. The act is the collective witness. The witnessing is the act, because that is enough to dismantle the secrecy of the drone war, right? So once we insert a presence beyond the individuated human agent, we can dismantle all the affect that comes around justifying the drone war due to its secrecy, right? So again, the hacking of the U.S. military drone through the little girl's image punctures the closeness of that the institution relies on to carry out the attacks. By introducing the possibility that the military drone network is the self-same as the digital public arena that we call the World Wide Web, the drone agent can no longer be alone in the act. The unshakable presence of a material collective witness interrupts the master narrative that normalizes our complicity in the United States drone war. This narrative supported by the myth of individually marked bodies and individuated agency. And it suggests rather that the networking of our various subjectivities equally bloodies the hands of all involved in such atrocities.
Okay, so no, you're fine. It's way more interesting than what I have to say. The title of my presentation is "The Collapse of Spheres, Politics, and Digital Communication, and the Rise of Personal Ethics." That's a really long title. Basically, this is kind of a work in progress, but I am interested, and I've been working with my students and having conversations with them about how digital media communication, specifically Twitter as a public forum, right, changed how we deliberate and how we make political arguments. And basically, my contention is that literally, in the art of argumentation, something like Twitter allows us to make a claim, and make a claim that need not have an awareness of how that claim would impact the public. So an example of this would be, in the traditional form of argumentation, I would say that I do not like President Obama's tax reform because it is making it very hard for small businesses to make money. And for example, I'm going to use my father's shop, right? I'm going to say my dad is losing money, but that would be my example. That's a solid argument. Whether or not you agree with it need not matter. It's an ethical argument. I'll get into that in a moment. But what Twitter allows us to do, and what, perhaps a personal blog or Reddit, these kinds of things, what allows me to do is I can make that argument. I say, I don't like President Obama's tax reform because it caused my father to shut down his shop. I don't need that link in the middle in which I extrapolate what is happening to my father to the much larger public discourse. And it's almost, Scott and I were talking yesterday, it has this built-in infamy, right? Where you don't have, everything becomes enthematic, everything becomes a leap in logic, because I don't have to contemplate what is the ethical implication of what I'm saying in terms of my position as a member of the public, right? As a member of a democracy. And this is kind of, it's new because of scale, it's new because of reach, it's new because of openness and transparency and all of these things, and now we have this ability to make these arguments and to be heard in ways that really never existed previous. So I'll jump into that and kind of explain some of the theory behind this idea. So the political arena is a public space that ought to be one of open deliberation. This notion is forwarded really in terms of rhetorical scholarship, right, with Aristotle, his work on rhetoric and ethics. Aristotle, in response to Plato, sees the value very much of democracy and rhetoric within democracy, and the ability for the citizen to have an effect on the demos, right, on the polis, on the city-state. And of course, it's an argument that is furthered by Hannah Arendt when she's talking about the separation of the public and the private ethical spheres. And it's something that I teach to my undergraduates in ethical communication, communication ethics. And again, a conversation that we have a lot. Within this space, to be ethical is to be open to and engage in ethical public discourse, to be transparent, if you will. Deliberate discourse where different perspectives have a forum to be heard, where learning from difference takes place. And I took some notes about everybody else's presentation. This idea of transparency, right? Yes, you are transparent. Yes, you are aware, but there's a learning that's supposed to take place in the public sphere. Yes, it's open to different perspectives, and you can say whatever you want, but part of that ethics of the public sphere is listening to other people's perspectives, right? You don't just mute it, you have to listen to them. And when we're, it makes it much easier to not have to listen, I suppose, when we're so focused on just being heard. So in relation to rhetoric, argumentation, and reasoning, we might understand this space as a discursive one with its own set of rules, institutions, apparatuses, its own truth, its own way of being. And so I'm coming at this ethics as kind of a technology in itself, technology of governance and technology of leadership, whatever you call it. Foucault would call it technology of governance, but ethics is a way to get people to make decisions in the right way, right, according to a truth. And so that is how I'm kind of studying this. What happens when the truth of ethics changes, right? Especially public discourse ethics. What happens when that truth, that assumption, these things now change, right? And what it means to be ethical in the public sphere, what happens when they change, and how does that impact us as citizens, as individuals, as members of communities? This discursive space produces a certain type of subject, right? A well-governed, self-governed citizen with an ethical awareness of the public and their place within it. In terms of rhetoric and argumentation, we might think of how our ethical obligations to members of publics impact our interpretation of our place within the public and our roles as public deliberators, right? So, I am as a rhetor, I'm cognizant of what I say and how that is going to impact my public. I'm going to, change what I say. I'm going to create my message or invent my message according to the public ethics. So it's kind of, you're taking value from it and also adding value to it. However, social media as a technology of communication has really changed this space, right? And so it's really my contention that it's disrupted the differentiation between the public space of discourse and the private space of discourse. They've collapsed into each other in many ways. And as a result, not only have the forms of reasoning and argumentation changed within these spaces, but what it means to be an ethical member of the public has changed as well. And I think that's what's really, really important. So again, to really make my point clear and to highlight the argument, I would really want to expand further. The governing technology of ethics, right, specifically public discourse ethics, has drastically changed in the modern moment due primarily to the impact of social media communication, which has resulted in a new understanding of what it means to be ethical, and subsequently how that knowledge guides the choices that we make, the arguments that we make, the claims that we stake. We now govern ourselves according to a new form of public discourse ethics, and that's what I'm really interested in kind of looking at and unpacking. The result is a public discourse, a new form of public deliberation, and a new discourse of governance where being ethical no longer means awareness and openness to different perspectives that we must listen to and attempt to learn from. Okay, so I have my own opinion, I can justify that opinion, and I can do so without really tethering it to the larger public conversation, which for Aristotle is very much a part of our duty as public citizens. You can stake your claim, but again, that claim must be tethered to the public good, okay? Especially if you are doing this in a public forum, which is in many ways what something Twitter is, but that has seemed to kind of fall on the wayside, where that ethical awareness of the public need not matter as much as me having my private argument heard. Instead, what matters is the entry of the private perspective into the public sphere in a way that forecloses deliberation, right? And that's what's key, again, to my argument. One of the goods that is protected by public discourse ethics, right, by Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, is the idea of deliberation, right? The public space should be a space of deliberation. It should be a space where you hear perspectives. But I don't have to worry about deliberation when I just put something out there, and I'm not forced to listen to the perspectives of others. I can just use my argument and stop it there without having to listen. The individual now sees themselves as ethical, right, because they believe they are taking part in public discourse, and I think this is kind of key, a leap in my own logic here, right? This is a new space, right, where the individual believes themselves to be ethical because they are following the ethical rules of this new public space. And so I'm not asking the individual to be critical of their spot, right? This is, to me, this is a more a product of the new discursive space, more so than having the individual be aware of their duty to the public. No, I think this is a result of advancements in digital communication. Sorry. When in fact, right, so what these individuals are doing are using private experience in public deliberation without ever tethering it to, right, the wider public perspective. Okay, and so I have this argument now, and I see it working, but I'm trying to figure out the object of study, right, to bring it back into rhetorical studies. And there was a Pew Research, piece of Pew Research publication came out 6 or 7 months ago, and it's basically looking at political communities within Twitter and making the argument, well, not making the argument, the data seems to show that once you have discovered your political community on Twitter, you don't expand beyond that political community, right? You get the people that you want to get. And that's, I mean, that's what's key, right? And I think we get so angry with, the right and the left making these arguments, but to me, it's not the individual. This is a product of the technology itself, right? So that's what I would like to kind of unpack. But hopefully, this will be completed by the end of the summer. So that's what I'm working with now. But you don't have to clap for me. As the first. We have 14 minutes. I wanted to say a few remarks about the four of you because it was really, really interesting. And I guess the theme that I was drawing out again is this idea of transparency. Each one of you had talked about transparency in many ways. as, again, one of these goods that we protect and promote. But it seems like what digital technology has allowed us to do is protect and promote only transparency without the other goods that should be protected. And so what happens